Welcome back to the second and final video in my pre-election series. Earlier last week, we ran through the Senate map, and I explained why, based on polling information and structural conditions, that the blue wave the media has been memeing about is unlikely to happen. Republicans are poised to reverse the losses they suffered in 2016 and return to a 54 or 55 seat majority in the Senate. And this is massively important because it will allow President Trump to accomplish things like immigration reform, further tax cuts, and even possibly an end to birthright citizenship. Of course, at the federal level, there is also the House of Representatives. All 435 House seats are up for re-election this year. And despite what the general ballot polling is suggesting, based on early voting numbers and general political momentum, I'm still inclined to believe that Republicans will hold on to the House. There's simply too much to talk about, too much information, too much to get into to make a video about it. But I'm sure there are going to be some deep dives done in podcast form that I would recommend checking out. I'll include a link below to the deep dive done on the Senate that I thought to be pretty good. And they actually reached an even more optimistic conclusion on the Senate than I did. But there is a third set of elections that I'm almost certain you haven't heard much about. With all of the attention focused nationally on President Trump, the Senate, and the House, it seems like people have forgotten entirely about state-level elections. These are the elections closer to the bottom of your ballot, the ones you might forget to mark because you don't know what's going on, so you just leave them blank. But in many cases, these races are just as, if not more important, than your local congressman. In this video, I want to talk specifically about governorships, the chief executive of every state across America. In addition to all 435 representatives and 30-something senators, over half of the nation's governorships are up for grabs this election cycle. 36 out of 50 governors are up for re-election this year, and unlike the Senate map, this map looks extremely advantageous for the Democratic Party. You see, while senators have no term limits and can run forever until they die, most states have limits on how many terms a governor can serve. And in most cases, this is 2 terms. So not only do we see a lot of gubernatorial elections this year, we see a ton of open seats where governors have been term limited out of office. This video will be divided into 4 parts. First, what do governors even do, and why do they matter? Second, what issues are going to come up for governors over the next 4 to 6 years? Then, I won't go deeply into detail in each state, but I'll offer my predictions about how each race will shape up and what the balance of power will look like after the dust is settled. And finally, we'll talk about why local politics matter. All of this ahead in today's video, but first, actually, let's just get into it. So, in America, we have 3 branches of federal government. That's legislative, executive, and judicial. Well, each state in the US has a similar structure. There is a state house, a governor, and a state Supreme Court. In a way, you can think of your state's governor as the president of your state. They're both chief executives. Many of their responsibilities and roles are the same, too. Governors have the ability to veto legislation, make certain political appointments, manage the state's bureaucracy, etc. One key difference between governors and the president is that most governors can use what's called line item veto. Instead of vetoing whole bills, they can veto certain provisions of bills. Additionally, while the president gets to appoint his whole cabinet, in most states, cabinet-level positions are elected. For example, in Washington at least, voters elect the state lands commissioner, attorney general, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, etc. In 12 states, the Secretary of State is appointed. In some states, land commissioners are appointed. It all depends on what state you live in. The specifics of the cabinet, elected versus appointed and so on, vary from state to state. But the governors in each state are the chief executives for that state's bureaucracy. Governors are always important, but I believe they'll be especially important over the next 4 to 6 years of the Trump presidency. There's a renewed interest in federalism and the 10th Amendment every time the presidency changes hands. For example, under President Obama, Republican states were fervently working to find ways to be exempt from Obamacare. And under President Trump, blue states are competing with each other to be as friendly to illegal aliens and as unfriendly to federal law enforcement as possible. State governors often have the ability to oversee redistricting in their state, drawing the boundaries for congressional districts. With the 2020 census and redistricting coming up, this is more important than ever before. It's an unfortunate truth, but it's the reality. If you aren't drawing districts that benefit you, the other guy definitely will be. A state with a 50-50 Republican to Democrat voter split and 10 congressional districts, just hypothetically, could be drawn to have 10 Republican districts, 10 Democrat districts, or 5 and 5. It all depends on how the district boundaries are being drawn. You've heard the term gerrymandering before. This is exactly what they're talking about. And you know that if Democrats control the redistricting boards, they're going to find ways to draw districts in a manner that benefits them. This is accomplished by looking at racial and voting demographics and drawing, on purpose, districts that are approximately 55% Democrat and 45% Republican. Using this strategy, you can realistically make it so that a 55% Republican and 45% Democrat state has a majority Democrat districts. It's all about how population centers are divided up. Governors also have the ability to decide or approve state policy with regard to immigration enforcement. States that vote in the legislature to become sanctuary states and refuse cooperation with ICE can be prevented from doing so by a strong governor. Likewise, a Democrat governor could go rogue and instruct his state bureaucracy to stop cooperating with federal agents. In short, governors have much more control over the implications of national politics than you might think. In addition to redistricting, which will happen after the 2020 census, governors elected this term are expected to face questions relating to immigration and gun control, with many states, including Washington where I live, plotting new ways to take guns out of the hands of safe, law-abiding owners. So those are the stakes. Now, let's look at the electoral situation. If you want to feel good and uplifted about the future, this might not be the video for you, because things are looking significantly better across the nation for the Democrats. Here's the big picture. Currently, there are 16 Democrat governors, 33 Republicans, and 1 independent. It's worth noting that since the Tea Party surge in 2010, Republicans have been extremely successful at the state level all across the country. But with that high number of Republican governors comes a high number of offices to defend. And with the limited number of incumbents, there are quite a few races that are free-for-alls, totally up in the air. Additionally, the lower profile of gubernatorial races as compared to Senate races means that polling here is much more sparse. For many of these races, only 2 or 3 polls have been conducted in totality, meaning that we could all be in for a shock on election day. As usual, we will not be talking about races that are not up for re-election, safe offices, or the races rated as likely wins. We'll be talking in today's video about the leaning races and the toss-ups. If you recall from the Senate video, there were 33 seats up for election and only 6 races rated as toss-ups. There are 36 gubernatorial contests that will be decided tomorrow, November 6th, and RCP has 11 of them rated as toss-ups at the time of this video being written. That's where you see the sparseness of the polling come out, and the tension in state politics. Governors tend to be elected on a more pragmatic rather than ideological basis. It's why you'll see Republican governors getting reelected in deep blue states like Massachusetts. These guys aren't ideological firebrands. They're more policy wonk, middle management types. Anyways, we have 2 lean GOP races, 11 toss-ups, and 5 lean Dem races that we'll talk about today. Just a cursory look at those numbers, and one will be quick to notice that by a margin of 5-2, those races are breaking for the Democrats. But if you look deeper into the numbers, it gets even worse. Out of the 18 races that are leaning or toss-ups, 13 of those 18 are currently held by Republicans. With only 2 leaning towards Republicans, it looks like we may be setting up for quite a few lost governorships. Now, some of these aren't real toss-ups, so let's start there. South Dakota, for example, has seen a tight race between Kristi Noem and Billy Sutton, but Trump's strong favorability in the state, 57%, and Sutton's rising unfavorables expect this one to go Republican. And likewise, in Kansas, another state where Trump is popular, I expect Chris Kobach to win easily. But from there, it gets more complicated. Democrats are going to win Connecticut, Ohio, Oregon, and probably Wisconsin, where Chamber of Commerce favorite Scott Walker appears poised to lose a nail-biter versus Tony Evers, state superintendent of public instruction. And, for good measure, I'm expecting Republicans to pull out wins in Alaska, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Nevada. But then you have states like Colorado, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, and New Mexico, the lean Dem states, where these races are pretty much over already. So out of the 18 leaning and toss-up states, so far we have 7 Republican wins and 9 Democrat wins. It all comes down to Georgia and Florida. In Georgia, all-around badass Brian Kemp is running against Stacey Abrams, a hero of leftist pop media. He's leading by a few points in the polls, but the question here is going to be turnout. If Abrams turns out the black vote, she wins. But if Kemp turns out the white vote, he wins. Oh, you can't talk like that. That's racist. No, it's not racist. It's true. The pundit class has observed as much already. In multiracial democracies, elections just become a question of racialized voter turnout. And Georgia is an example of this. I expect a win by Kemp here. And in Florida, as much as DeSantis obviously should win, I'm not sure he will. His opponent is Andrew Gillum, the corrupt mayor of Tallahassee and apparently the subject of an FBI probe. This guy took bribes from an undercover FBI agent and bragged about it. And his entire campaign has been based around calling Whitey a racist. You think I'm exaggerating? Gillum, after being attacked on the campaign trail for taking inappropriate gifts from an undercover FBI agent while mayor of Tallahassee, doubled down and insisted he did nothing wrong. He was a good guy, and attacks relating to his corruption were actually just an expression of white people being racist. It's like if The Root ran a political campaign, except it has a chance to win. However, we've seen Republicans be underpolled in Florida in the past. Polls underestimated Trump's margin of victory in 2016, and I think we'll see a boost for DeSantis in the final count too. Plus, Gillum's coalition is relying on minority turnout, and we know that getting minorities to the polls can be a challenge. I very well may be wrong about this one, but I would expect a DeSantis win by less than 1%. So the final tally then is 9-9. But that's not good news, and here's why. Under this analysis, Democrats are expected to flip governorships in Maine, Michigan, New Mexico, Ohio, and Wisconsin. With Republicans flipping Alaska from independent to Republican, that's a net pickup of 4 offices by Democrats. However, they're also expected to defeat Illinois Republican Bruce Rauner in a blowout, meaning yes, Democrats are expected to pick up 5 new governorships this election. The end result being, of course, that Democrats will control 22 governorships to the Republicans' 28. Alright, so why should you care? Well, let's think about those issues being mentioned before. Many of these incoming Democrat governors, including J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, are going to push for severe restrictions on the Second Amendment. The state of Washington is an example. Our current state attorney general and likely next governor, Bob Ferguson, wants to pursue a semi-automatic weapon ban and a ban on magazines larger than 10 rounds. So you can expect gun control to not be pushed so much at the federal level, but at the state level. Because while Democrats won't have the ability to impose sweeping national regulations on things like semi-automatic rifle purchasing age, bump stocks, or large magazines, they can, and certainly will, pursue these things in states they control. The result of increased gun control will be an increasingly disarmed and vulnerable population. Next, with Democrats in charge of more redistricting than ever before, right before the 2020 census, expect the House of Representatives to take another shift to the left for the 2022 midterms. Also, do you like this trend of Democrat state attorney generals suing the president for the great crime of doing his job? Like this lawsuit against President Trump where Democrats are suing because they don't want the census to ask whether or not people are citizens? Well, with more Democrat governors and presumably more Democrat attorney generals, we're in for a lot more of that. There is, however, a way to change this and prevent things like this from happening in the future. There's a phrase in politics, all politics is local, and that can be used to mean a variety of different things. But in this case, state-level politics quite literally are local. I would encourage each of you out there to go to Google or Facebook, type in your county and then GOP. For example, Spokane County GOP, Whitman County GOP, etc., to find your local party's organization. From there, get a couple friends and start going to their open meetings, or start going alone. I know from the analytics that I have a pretty young audience, and I know for a fact that most of these county organizations are largely old people, and they love it when young people get involved. Getting involved in local politics gives you a voice. It gives you a seat at the table when decisions are being made about what positions to adopt, what policies to fight for, what candidates to nominate, etc. Are you tired of seeing terrible, neoconservative corporate GOP candidates get elevated in the party? Well, that's only going to stop happening when young, determined, passionate people get out there and begin to remake the party in our image. In many cases, there are no people under the age of 40 involved in these local parties. That's not an exaggeration. If you show up as a young person, you will be listened to and brought in on the decision-making process. If you demonstrate yourself to be sociable, nice, and competent, you'll probably be given a leadership position. The meta-political struggle is important. The meme war, media, all of that is important. Debate in the public space is important. But taking control of these institutions that we can and remaking them in a younger, more America-first image, that is a powerful vector of activism that hasn't really been explored yet. If you're sitting there looking for some way to get involved, some way to help change things, some way that you can spend a few hours a week actually trying to make things better in the real world, not online, consider getting involved in local politics. Not only will you begin building a network, which could prove to be extremely valuable, you'll also be able to convince people with political influence